Welcome, everybody. My name is Joanna Cohn. I'm director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control, and I'm so excited to welcome you to today's Innovations in Tobacco Control lecture series. Our guest today is Dr. Eric Crosbie. He is a political scientist at the University of Nevada in Reno, and his research focuses on the commercial determinants of health and public health policy. Specifically, he examines how commercial industries such as the tobacco industry, the food and beverage industry, the alcohol industry, and the pharmaceutical industry, and the fossil fuel industry, how all these industries are a key driver of the non-communicable disease epidemic and how they influence public health regulations and policy. His research is multidisciplinary, and he combines elements of public health, political science, international relations, economics, law, and business to examine public health policy both locally and globally. So Dr. Crosbie's research has analyzed smoke-free environments and sugar-sweetened beverage taxation regulations here in the US, but he also conducts a lot of global research, examining tobacco and nutrition packaging and labeling policies and the impact of trade on health. In his work, Dr. Crosbie collaborates with health organizations and health advocates to disseminate the research findings to policymakers, including publishing research in Spanish to reach wider audiences. Dr. Crosbie also works with undergraduate and graduate students to publish and present research. So it's my pleasure, and I'm really excited to hear his talk on the evolution of standardized packaging. So I'm gonna, without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to you, Eric. Thanks so much for being here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joanna, for having me, and welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. I had to jump over to my phone. We had some technical difficulties, but you guys can hear me okay? Today, I'm going to be talking about kind of a couple different studies and giving you an overview of tobacco standardized packaging. And just one note, I will probably refer to this as plain packaging throughout the presentation and go back to standardized packaging, but they essentially mean the same thing. So if there's any confusion there, if I say one word over the other, just note that. So just to begin, I just want to point out, and acknowledge, again, talking about a couple different studies here, the support that I've gotten over the years. So obviously from my university, University of Nevada, Reno, but I also come from UCSF, the University of California, San Francisco, and working there for many years, and then getting grant funding from the National Cancer Institute, from the National Institute of Health, and then also Fulbright Commission. And then currently, and I'll be mentioning this later in my presentation, there's a PhD candidate, Luciana Borges, who is doing this type of research for her dissertation, is conducting a systematic review on standardized plain packaging. So I'm going to be reporting some of her initial results, but also want to acknowledge our other co-author on that piece, Courtney McNamara, who's from Newcastle University. And just to disclaim, I have no conflicts of interest. So this is an overview of what I want to talk to today. So it's three key areas. First, I'm just going to give you kind of a background and kind of the evolution of tobacco standardized packaging, and just talk about a little bit about the evidence that has been recorded to date. And then going to identify some of the key barriers and facilitators to tobacco standardized packaging, and then end with, again, our systematic review that we're currently conducting right now. So this is the first section we're going to talk about, which is the evolution and evidence of tobacco standardized packaging. So there may be many of you on this call that are familiar with the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the FCTC. But for those of you who are not, this is the first and only global public health treaty that came into effect in 2005. This is a evidence-based treaty that's based on recommendations and science that's been collected throughout the world that focuses on trying to reduce tobacco consumption worldwide. And then a big focus of these recommendations are based on both tobacco supply side and demand side measures. And so you can see here on the right, there are different articles of this convention that focus on creating smoke-free environments, or focus on the packaging and labeling of the products, or the advertising, promotion, and sponsorship of these products. And then today, 90% of the population is, is a party or is in a country or jurisdiction that's a party to this convention. And now there's over 183 parties. And if you go to the next slide, you can just see how much, there in orange in the world, how many countries have ratified the treaty and that are parties. You'll notice here that, in green, there are some countries like our own, the United States, that actually signed the FCTC back in 2003, 2004, and 2005, but they have not yet ratified the treaty. So they're not, full members in the sense that they participate in annual meetings and things of that nature. So, like, for example, this week, we have the Conference of the Parties meeting, which is happening currently in Panama, COP10. And so the U.S. can send certain delegations, things of that nature, but they can't, negotiate as much as some of the other parties. So, and specifically, when you look at the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the FCTC, and for our discussion today on tobacco standardized packaging, Article 11 and Article 13 really have direct provisions that relate to this policy. And so Article 11, which deals with packaging and labeling, obviously this is kind of in its wheelhouse. And there are specific recommendations and guidelines about that, the parties should adopt measures that restrict or even prohibit the use of these kind of logos, colors, brands, and in this kind of neutral or standard font, color, size that gets the word standardized packaging. But also Article 13, which focuses on tobacco advertising, promotion, and sponsorship. They also talk about advertising and promotion on the package, because has been considered by many as a kind of a mobile billboard that you leave it out somewhere and you're promoting that brand anywhere you go. So these are just recommendations that are based on introducing, adopting, and implementing this policy. So this is going to require a lot of next. This has a lot of animations, but this gives you kind of a history of like pictorial health warning labels and kind of why labeling came into the packaging. So if you go next. So in 1966, the United States was actually the first country that introduced, health warning labels, textual health warnings on the side of the package. So if you hit next, you'll see it there highlighted, and then hit next. And so this happened in the United States in 1966. And then and what's kind of sad is that we still have very similar warnings from 1966. In the 1980s, they altered some of the language, but we still have those textual warnings on the side. And we have actually adopted, with the family smoking prevention provision during the Obama administration, these graphic pictorial health warnings, but they just have not been implemented, and they've been tied up in courts, and that's a whole other story, but for another day. But as these policies have evolved, so if you can go ahead and hit next and next and next, so then you started to get these, bigger textual warnings, and New Zealand. Then you have, more kind of languages in different countries, and then if you can kind of stop here. The first pictorial health warnings actually were introduced in 1985 in Iceland. I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that, because most people think the first pictorial warnings were actually in Canada, but they actually happened in Iceland, and they're, you can see them. They're kind of like their first attempts. And then if you go ahead next, and then really this idea of what is considered plain packaging, if you leave it here. If you look in some of the industry documents, these were some images that we captured, where basically the industry had thought about, okay, what would this look like? And in the late 1980s in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, they were starting to propose this idea that, maybe you should remove, maybe you should put these health warning labels on the package, but you should really remove all the branding. And so this idea of plain packaging was really thought of like this, where you put, okay, you have a textual warning, but then you just, you have a very plain font and dull color that just says, this is plain packaging. So if you go ahead and push next. So these were introduced both in Canada and Australia in the 1990s. But then there was big litigation from the tobacco companies and threats, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that eventually got rid of this policy, these two proposals. They never became policies, as well as the Iceland policy. So if you go ahead and go next. So those are gone. And then if you go next, And then we resume, and you can go next, next, to next. If you resume, then in Canada, 2001, they introduced these graphic pictorial health warnings. So viewer discretion is advised. And then in Uruguay, these bigger warnings. And then we come all the way to 2012 next. And now you have, if you hold it here, this idea of standardized or plain packaging where you strip away all the branding, but now you also include these pictorial health warning labels, graphic images, and now you only see the trademark here at the bottom where it says Marlboro Red. And so this could be where you have Philip Morris, or Marlboro cigarettes or Camel and so forth. Okay, so go ahead and go next. So there you can see kind of the evolution of where we've gone. So, fast forward now to it's focusing on plain packaging. There's also been, big momentum internationally. So obviously Australia was the first country to introduce this back in 2012. Initial countries to follow right after included the UK, Ireland, so countries in Europe like France, and then New Zealand. And if you go next, and then Rob Cunningham and his group in Canada, they do these annual evaluations of looking at health warning labels. And so this was their latest report that came out a year or so ago that shows basically kind of the order of when these policies have been adopted and kind of how they've spread over the years. So you can see here, when 2012 wasn't many countries for a couple of years, but then now you fast forward to 2022, and even now 2024, there's about, I think it's 24 countries now that have at least implemented plain packaging. There's a number of countries that are still, debating and discussing, and some that have even adopted the policy but haven't implemented yet. So countries like Mauritius in Africa, or Cote d'Ivoire, who have passed the policy but haven't implemented it yet. But here it shows you that these policies are diffusing, even though kind of it's not happened as quickly as maybe some other policies. They are spreading throughout the world. But one thing to keep in mind, so here you can see here in red, these are the countries that have implemented these policies. And so we can look at, globally, there's a lot of countries in Europe. Obviously, you have the South Pacific, so Australia, New Zealand. And then you have, a couple countries like Uruguay and others, and like I mentioned, Mauritius and others. But you can still see there's a lot of gray in the world. There's a lot of countries that have not adopted or introduced or implemented plain packaging. So if we compare this image with, as a reminder, in orange are all the countries that are party to the FCTC. So if we only have 24 of the 180 countries, right, we still have a lot of work to do. So that had us start thinking about barriers and facilitators, like why is this policy not diffusing maybe as fastly or as fast as some other policies? So that gets us to thinking about, okay, so how do we look at different barriers and facilitators? So this goes to kind of the second part of my presentation of looking at some of the studies we've conducted and some of the early studies to notice, what is the reason? Like why did it take this long for these, health policies to really diffuse over the last 50, 60, 70 years, but especially in these last 20 years. So for those of you who work in public health, I think you're used to, doing a lot of measuring in terms of measuring the health outcomes. But when we're looking here in terms of policy adoption and implementation, we are more focused on kind of the policy outputs. And so this is just one illustration. There are, many around the world, but if you look at something like the policy cycle model, so if you look here at the left, and there's different iterations of this, but there's typically, stages or steps that, when a policy is first introduced and when it's, goes through committees and things of that nature, there's a whole kind of world, a political world that exists to, how you actually create policy. And so you start with the agenda setting, and then you do policy formulation, and then you adopt it, and then you implement it, and then you evaluate it. And it's a cyclical process that, once you gather the data and research, you then reinsert this to a new policy to try to update it or amend it to advance it in certain ways. And so if you can hit the animation, go to the right. But, if a bill is introduced, then it goes to committee. And then, if like say it's a health committee, they can amend it, they can, alter it, they can reject it. Then they eventually vote on it. And then depending on which country, a lot of us here in the kind of the Western hemisphere have presidential systems. So there's a bicameral chamber where you have a house or an upper house or lower Senate, and then it goes to like a conference committee, and then if eventually the president can sign it, and it can go it can be, vetoed and sent back to the Congress to override that. So you can keep hitting the slide button next. And so this is just to show you how complicated this process is. So like every part of these stages, there can be various barriers and facilitators that actually help a policy that's introduced to actually ultimately being adopted and then implemented. So again, not trying to confuse everybody there, but just to give you an idea. So what I'm trying to focus on today is to show you that what our big focus here in research is looking at these different barriers and facilitators. And ultimately, if we can understand what barriers and what facilitators actually either help or hinder a policy from either being adopted or being implemented, we can then identify and get those policy outputs that then ultimately achieve all these very desirable health outcomes that I think a lot of us in public health, aim to do. And so if we look at, and again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but there's been a lot of literature that has studied the effects of uh, standardized packaging on adolescents, kids, current smokers in numerous countries around the world. And so I'm not going to go through all the data, but there's experimental designs, there's modeling, there's actual data and looking at pre and post implementation. But just to outline a couple of these health outcomes. I mean, obviously, there's an increase in salience and recall of the actual health warnings different participants have noticed. It increases the negative feelings about smoking. It obviously reduces the pack and product appeal. And I think these last two are most important in terms of prevention. Is it helps? There's some early studies that show that it's helping prevent youth initiation, so young people from beginning to smoke, and it's also helping communicate the harmful effects of smoking to smokers. So I think most smokers assume they may get lung disease, but you can have blindness, or you can get gangrene, or you can have oral cancer, and so it's really helping to communicate those harms. And so again, this is just one example of this evidence from Australia. And so if you look at this, the curve here it's kind of hard, this is a little blurry, but on the y-axis, you can see the smoking prevalence. So Australia's done a great job of really reducing the amount of people who smoke in the country, again, mostly based on surveys from the turn of the century. But you can see here, right when the standardized packaging law was implemented, and again, this was introduced also with other initiatives like reducing taxation, increasing tobacco taxes and some other measures. And so it's not that plain packaging is a silver bullet or a magic bullet that can change everything, but part of a comprehensive plan. It can actually help reduce some of these prevalence levels. And they actually have teased out some of the taxation and other policies to still show that it's declined. But you can see here in the blue, if nothing happened, like it would steadily go down. But in the green, obviously, it's made a huge impact and kind of accelerated the decline in prevalence of smoking in Australia. And so this is kind of a turning point in my kind of my own personal focus into plain packaging and how I got really interested in this. I was actually doing some work at UCSF, and for those of you who are not familiar, highly, highly encourage you to go look at this website. It's called the Industry Documents Library, and this is housed at UCSF, where they actually have a lot of the hard copies. But now these documents are publicly available to anybody who would like to search them. And what these are, this is a database of former tobacco industry, correspondence, memos, playbooks, plans. So it's really revealing a lot of their inner strategies. And so for researchers like myself, it's a great way to kind of get behind the veil and to read word for word what these industries are doing instead of speculating about their activity. And so if we're looking at kind of barriers and facilitators to plain packaging, what better way than to understand how the companies think about these policies? And so these documents came available through a bunch of lawsuits here in the United States in the 1990s and then some. But what's good to know is if you hit next, that these documents started as a tobacco industry collection. But as Joanna mentioned at the beginning, I focus a lot on commercial determinants of health, looking at other industry sectors. And so now they have collections with the opioids, chemical, drug, food, and fossil fuel industry. And so there's a lot of pending court cases currently going on now against Juul, the electronic cigarette manufacturer, as well as a bunch of opioid lawsuits that are happening. And even John Hopkins, I've talked with a couple team members there. They also are working on the litigation and collecting those documents and partnering with UCSF. And so it's just a great, valuable resource that if you don't know about it, I highly recommend looking into it. And so anyways, going back 15 years ago, I was doing some research looking at tobacco control in Costa Rica. And there was these interesting things about trade. And I stumbled across these really fascinating documents, again, searching about Costa Rica, but found stuff about global plans back in the 80s and 90s about how the industry was worried about plain packaging. And at the time, I think it was around 2009, 2010. So Australia was just starting to propose their policy, actually, which had been dormant for a while. And I remember I was working at UCSF, so I was working with Stan Glantz, but then Laurent Huber, who worked at the Framework Convention Alliance, who was actually going to a lot of these COP meetings, which again is happening this week, was saying, "Oh my gosh, this trade stuff is huge." And so I was finding all these documents, and I said, "Okay, Stan had said, okay, go a little deeper. Hold on to Costa Rica for a minute, and go a little deeper into these documents." So go ahead and go to the next slide. And so I'm going to show you a series of documents, these internal documents that we found that pertain to plain packaging. So this first document is from 1985. If you hit next, and this is a document stating from Philip Morris International and Hugh Coleman, who is the vice chairman. And if you hit next one more time, so he's talking about how they're fearful of regulation. But what I love about this document is it reminds us how transnational and global these big tobacco companies are, and so that they never think about one country in isolation, but they really think about this idea of diffusion. And I love this quote. It says, as one of our Australian colleagues puts it, "A sneeze in one country today causes international pneumonia tomorrow." And so again, that fear of diffusion. And so if you go to the next slide, and again, this is fast forward now to the 1990s, because of what I mentioned earlier of Australia and Canada, who were proposing this idea, that the original idea of plain packaging, a lot of the companies got really worried, and they started talking with each other, and they said, well, we need to form like this plain pack group. So all the major transnational corporations at the time, which some of them still exist, right? British American Tobacco, Philip Morris International, Imperial, so forth. They got together and started saying, okay, we need to, talk together and kind of plan this out. So they got like a really big global plan together and developed really a trade strategy, which I'll talk about. So go ahead, go next. And so the big thing that they started to focus on is looking at moving this issue away from health, which they were losing, and kind of framing the debate into an area of trade and investment. And so let me try to explain this. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but just to kind of kind of so you understand what the argument that they were trying to make, and that they still continue to make, is that basically that they were trying to argue and still continue to argue is that you have these global international treaties like the World Trade Organization, globally, but then you have regional agreements like the European Union. In the United States, we have the North American Free Trade Agreement, which now has been shuffled around, and now it's the USMCA agreement with Canada and Mexico. But these agreements, for business purposes, had established rules to protect investment overseas. So imagine if you're Apple or Nike, and you're creating computers or Nike shoes across the world, and you're trying to protect your trademark, your logo, your intellectual property. And so these treaties had put in protections to say, like if you're going to sell Nike shoes in Brazil, you should be protected in case somebody tries to create like knockoff shoes or knockoff Apple computers. And so from a business standpoint, it made a lot of sense, right? You invest your time and energy and efforts to branding and your trademark, that you shouldn't be penalized if somebody's going to rip you off. So the industry tried making this argument with tobacco plain packaging by saying, if you look here at the trademark, like if you have plain packaging, now we can't use our trademark. Or if you have these very graphic images, you're restricting our use. So they went to their internal lawyers. They went to these different international bodies. Like in this case, it was the World Intellectual Property Organization, that they were basically trying to argue, like, shouldn't we be able to sue these governments for billions of dollars or millions of dollars if they won't let us use our trademark? But if you can see here, this is one slide. I'll show you a couple others. They basically said that they had no, legal basis for challenging this. And what it came out later to be was that instead of I'll try to explain it this way, instead of, the Nike or the Apple brand, somebody suing because somebody is, stealing their property or their intellectual property, they could then sue that third party, this case, someone who's stealing their property, and recoup those investments. So let's say, for example, I'm selling, Nike shoes, and Joanna is making knockoff Nike shoes. I could sue her under these international treaties and get compensation because that's the profits I should have made. But it's a difference when a government, in this case Australia, is trying to prohibit the restriction and is not turning around and selling Marlboro cigarettes. So they're not actually making a profit. So in essence, there's no legal basis because you're not suing somebody who's making profits, because the government is not making any profits. They're just saying you can't use your trademark. So anyways, fast forward to today. This has been, challenged in courts, and it's been actually proven publicly. But back then, privately, their lawyers were telling them, you can go to the next slide. Their lawyers were telling them that, they had no argument, that none of these treaties were going to help. This is just another slide that says, they couldn't go to the GATT, which was preceded the World Trade Organization. They couldn't go to the TRIPS, which is part of the World Trade Organization. And so they didn't know what to do. But then what we published this article in Tobacco Control that showed how these, privately, their lawyers and their legal bodies were telling them they had no legal argument, but then publicly they were continuing to threaten these governments. So first starting with Australia and Canada, and then they went into Uruguay and some of these smaller countries, and then even today, they're still using these lawsuits. And so it's an important reminder of how powerful these documents can be, because it gives us, like, word for word reading what they knew internally and how they act, publicly. So really, and there's a very famous, like, lawyers talk about this, like, anytime you find something legally, you try to throw as much stuff at the wall and you see what sticks. And this was something that actually stuck for, a couple decades and still technically sticks today. So this was great. I was at this time, Australia had just was just introducing plain packaging. And so I had done some research, and I traveled to Australia and I went to New Zealand, and I had talked with a couple of the policymakers. And this was one from New Zealand where they were, like, using our evidence and to showcase how these companies were just lying. So I don't know if you can play the video. This is just like a 30-second quick video
I
of
urge
this
everybody to
member
track
of
down
Parliament.
that argument, this paper, and to read it, because it shows that the companies decided to fight plain packaging on trade grounds because it provided them a more solid footing than allowing health issues to enter the debate. For this reason, they focused their energies on the intellectual property agreements governed by WIPO and the investment protection contained in NAFTA agreements. Despite being told repeatedly by WIPO they had no legal basis for their arguments, there was no legal basis for any of those arguments, that their analysis was flawed. Those companies persisted in telling the government, and this was Canada, and the public, that plain packaging would be inconsistent with international intellectual property protections.
So hopefully everybody was able to hear that, but it was obviously very exciting personally to see, like, our work being used in New Zealand to try to push this, but really calling out the industry for, what they knew and what they still know privately and what they're actually threatening publicly. So trying to dismay this. So okay, and then we just have probably about 5 or 10 minutes left. So I'm just going to report on. I'm going to probably go through these slides a little bit quicker. So as I mentioned at the beginning, one of our PhD candidates here, Luciana, is doing this for part of her dissertation research. So she's from Brazil, and she's doing a case study and more in depth in Brazil about this. But what we wanted to do was look systematically and see what evidence has been produced, in addition to a couple of the studies I mentioned just a minute ago, and what again are those barriers and facilitators to both passing and implementing plain packaging. And so first, what we did was, and Luciana obviously led more of these efforts, but looking at databases like PubMed and Web of Science, and then looking at categories of packaging and barriers and facilitators. We looked at all peer-reviewed studies from 2005 to 2022, and I think we'll go into 2023 as long as there's studies that come out. And we started 2005 because that's when some of the first studies were about plain packaging were being introduced. So that was kind of our focus. And so those of you who have done systematic reviews, this is probably familiar, but basically just these are search strategies. So looking at tobacco and packaging, and then looking at different terms that kind of mean barriers or facilitators, so whether it's obstacles or passing, things of that nature. And then as we extract the data, the thing that we're thinking about narratively is like, how do you manage all this heterogeneity and how do you group these studies? And so this is still a work in progress, but at the beginning, we thought about like looking at, okay, what's the level of focus, and then looking at the parameters. And so we would first, as we're reviewing the literature, looking at what's the study design, what are the findings, and like what would be our inclusion exclusion. So there's some articles that are like commentary pieces that just kind of highlight a couple things, which sometimes can be useful, but sometimes it's not really data that's collected. So we would exclude studies like that. But we also are using a couple different frameworks when we look at these barriers and facilitators. So there's been a couple studies done in tobacco control as well as the nutrition space. So for example, one study like the policy dystopia model, which is done by Ulsa Clancer et al. With Anna Gilmore and her team at Bath, looking at different industry and health advocacy arguments and actions, and so kind of a taxonomy of kind of what are their initial strategies, and then also we're looking at kind of level of focus. So are these studies national? Are they international? Are they regional in focus? And then a big consideration is are they high income studies or low and middle income studies? And if for those of you who've done work, and I know Joanna, you've done a lot of work internationally, there's a big difference between high income countries and tobacco consumption and low and middle income countries. And so looking at that is also important. So go ahead and go next. So these are some of the parameters that we are looking at. So there's different variables in some of the studies we've looked at, like contextual. So looking at what is the political and economic environment, what is the knowledge and awareness of this measure amongst the public in certain studies. For some others, it could be maybe COVID could be a contextual issue, or maybe if there's an economic crisis or a political turmoil. I know that, especially in some countries in Africa, there's been like state of emergencies, things of that nature. Then we look at government. So, as I mentioned, all those little mechanisms and institutions, like what are some of the levers that either help facilitate, policy adoption, or what are some institutional barriers that exist. And then the final two are kind of what we call in international relations non-state actors. So these are actors that operate outside the state or outside of government, but try to influence policy. So civil society includes obviously any tobacco control organizations. So anything from the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, or the American Heart Association or Lung Association, things of that nature. But then also regional groups or transnational groups. So like the Pan American Health Organization, the World Health Organization. So all these groups that are supporting plain packaging. And then you have the private sector, which mostly includes these transnational corporations, but also can include front groups and other organizations, trade associations that work with these groups that are barriers. And so we're looking at different strategies, different arguments that each of these groups are making. This is just to show the findings so far. So doing the systematic review, there are 784 eligible records. After looking at duplicates, it's 464. But what we found so far is 42 that have met the criteria. And if we look at level of focus, right, there's a lot of them that are kind of case studies, so looking at just, the national level of what happened in a certain country. There are some that are regional, and then there are actually more that are global. So these are ones that are typically that talk about, comparisons and across countries. And then if we look at income level, you can see a lot of the studies have been conducted in high income countries. So that's something to, consider. And if you look at the map and looking at these studies, I mean, this is reflective of where, the slide I showed earlier, where plain packaging has been introduced, which makes sense, right? That there's going to be more studies in the areas where the policy has actually been adopted or implemented. And then if we want to look a little deeper, we look at barriers, facilitators, pretty evenly spread. Obviously, there's still more barriers, and that's good because we want to understand like why the reasons why these policies are not being adopted. But that's what we see so far. And then next, and then another takeaway we've noticed so far. So if we look at the policy cycle model, and if there's two policy outputs we're looking for, it's policy adoption, so that it's passed, but then also once it's implemented. And so far, the majority of the studies have really focused only on the adoption phase and not the implementation phase. And for those of you who do work in low and middle income countries, especially, implementation is a huge problem. So you have a lot of these countries, especially in Latin America and in Africa, wonderful policies that have been adopted that follow all of the FCTC guidelines that look great on the books, but they're not being implemented, or they're not being implemented properly. And so that's a concern that there's not as many studies focusing on implementation yet. Just a couple more slides. So these are just some of the barriers we've noticed contextually. So as I mentioned, economic crisis, political instability, facilitators, those that have like a national strategy that kind of tailor theirs towards the FCTC. Obviously, there's a lot of policy learning. So when like there's a country like Australia that adopts it, New Zealand being close proximity, they learned a lot from that. And then having supportive media. If we look at government, we still see regulatory chill happening. So even if we go back to the Australia-New Zealand case, they're making those trade threats. And actually, it did delay the progress in New Zealand. They eventually adopted it, but they kind of took this wait and see-ish approach. And so regulatory chill, or kind of a chilling effect, means that if they're making these threats, is it dissuading not just the country they're threatening, in this case Australia, but other countries like New Zealand? So something to look at. And then facilitators, political will, participatory mechanisms, so forth. Okay, next. And then if we look at civil society, advocacy, and we can go deeper into that, but just, kind of running out of time here. And then community engagement, and then funds for NGOs. And then if we look at some of the private sector industry threats and lobbying, there's a whole playbook, and we can, if people are interested, we can go through that. So go next. And so you can look through, these are just some of the examples from the industry playbook. So they'll say things like, oh, the policy doesn't work, it's not reducing tobacco use. Other common arguments is that it will increase illicit trade. It will create problems for retailers, like they can't spend 10 seconds to find the package, that kind of stuff. This one's really interesting, sets a dangerous precedent. So in a lot of countries, they're using those slippery slope arguments, like if you have tobacco, what's next? And I'll show a slide with that. The trade threats are still coming up, so the intellectual property claims and trade law, that's a big thing that they're still threatening. They'll also argue that, the country's a nanny state, so that's another argument. And then, here's about their revenue, that they can get taxes, and then just lobbying. And then if you can just hit next one. So this is what I was mentioning earlier. We could go back one. So if you look at like this slippery slope argument, so this was from Australia. So it's like, okay, if we have plain tobacco packaging, what if they have plain beer bottles, like trying to get the alcohol industry involved. Okay. And then New Zealand, like, okay, I don't mind if alcohol is next, like the same kind of argument next. And then if you look at like the United Kingdom, same kind of idea. It's like, okay, if you have plain tobacco, it's your French fries or candy bars. And then same thing in Ireland. And then finally, I thought this one was interesting in France, because the French love their wine. Like, can you imagine if they're going to put this image on the bottle? So, just again, kind of these scare tactics and these slippery slope arguments. And actually, what's really funny, if you go back to Australia, you don't have to go back on the slides, but I remember when I was doing research there was the Wine Association they were so upset that they were being associated with the tobacco companies that they said, please do not mention us at any sentence with the tobacco companies, right? And so, which is important for us to remember that there's a credibility issue that the industry is fighting. So we also published research looking at, what are some of the facilitators and support for tobacco standardized packaging. So I didn't have enough time to go through all of this during my presentation, and I'm sure these slides will go out to everybody, but there's some great resources out there if you're working in your country on this issue. And of course, happy to talk to anybody further. But, the World Health Organization, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, the Cancer Council of Victoria, they got some great stuff, and so on and so on. So there's some great resources out there. And then, so just to conclude, tobacco standardized packaging continues to spread globally, as you saw. Like it's definitely every year there's more countries that are being adopted. But if you compare it to other areas like smoke-free policies or even tobacco advertising bans or just other regulations, other recommendations from the FCTC, the acceleration has not happened. And actually, there has been a chilling effect. It has not, diffused as many would have thought. So a key barrier obviously is the industry, but there's other areas there. Key facilitator we've seen so far is obviously the support of the FCTC and then transnational support. So different coalition groups working across borders to help one another. But we still need, at least from the initial data collected from the systematic review, we're still working on it. So open to your thoughts, comments, questions. But it does seem like there needs to be much more focused efforts on low and middle income countries. One, in the sense of supporting their efforts, to adopt policies, but also implement those. And then that way, once those policies are adopted, then we can actually collect more data on what's actually happening in these low and middle income countries, which can then also help us understand, more about the barriers and facilitators. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I open to any questions, comments that you have.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. You got through so much content over your phone, which is fantastic. And I really liked how you provided the history and the overview and set the stage for some of the work that you're doing and the importance of implementation and, of course, understanding the tobacco industry playbook. So this is fantastic. We have a couple questions, and for folks, we just have a few minutes, but please put your questions in the Q&A box. So let me just get started. So again, a thank you for a very interesting and informative presentation. With standardized packaging, it can also include standardizing the shape, the size, the material, the stick count, all kinds of aspects. And the question is, to what extent do you think are the arguments and strategies that you're finding may apply to developing and implementing these additional types of standards?
Yeah, it's a great question. I obviously did not have enough time to talk about all that. But there's a lot of movement and energy, mostly in Canada and New Zealand that I've seen, and I know it's around the world. But so people like Janet Howick in New Zealand, and anyone from Jim Thrasher to Guy Moody or David Hammond in Canada are looking at things like individual plain sticks. And so people that may not be familiar with this, so like the actual cigarette stick that has the filter, like the brown tan filter and the white cigarette, is somewhat, would argue, branding or kind of possesses an image towards that. And so there are efforts to not only like put plain sticks, so plain cigarettes, or put warnings on the sticks or dissuasive sticks. And there's a little bit of data that suggests that, not a lot, but it suggests that would deter some young people from beginning to smoke or alert, current smokers. And then in terms of like different shapes and sizes, the industry is just so clever that they, like when a country introduces like pictorial health warning labels on the package, like they did in Brazil, they didn't specify in the implementation where the like image needed to be. So they started manufacturing the image on the inside of the package or putting it at the bottom. So the industry is very clever if you don't get the right regulation. So implementation is so important to create all these loopholes or to things. And so countries have to learn from the guinea pigs who start first But what's so great about the industry documents, I think that's the second part of this question, and the research we're doing, is that the industry talks so much about how important branding and marketing is. And so we have this, bunch of data from the work that, Stan Glantz or Pam Ling has done in terms of marketing. So we know exactly how they think about marketing and stuff. And so we present that data to policymakers to show, if they're really upset about this, that's like very contradictory to what they're saying. And so we usually, and Joanna knows this, like we in tobacco control, we use the scream test. So like the louder the industry screams, the more you're kind of onto something. And so this is something that they've been screaming about for a while. So we know we're onto something.
Great. Thank you. We have a couple more questions we'll try and squeeze in. So regarding packaging, there's a question about not just thinking about the health benefits of plain and standardized packaging, but should we also be considering packaging that is more environmentally responsible, or any other strategies, sort of innovative strategies around packaging?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think the big area there is that, so a lot of the work that like Tom Novotny and others in California are doing is they're collecting cigarette butts. And so they are looking at the impact on the environment. So if we took that area just as one example, because I know we have a lot of time. So on one hand, like if you have plain sticks, then you can kind of match where those disposables are happening. But I think we see it a lot now with the new electronic delivery systems products. So electronic cigarettes or heated tobacco products, things of that nature, especially the disposable ones. And so if there are countries that have plain packaging regulations on conventional tobacco cigarettes, but they don't have the same regulations on some of these novel products. And so we have to then consider, okay, what would that look like? And so I'm not as up to date with all the research, but there are efforts like that are going on. So I think, and we have to keep in mind, and this is what's being discussed at the COP conference this week, is like, how do you regulate these new tobacco and nicotine products? And this is another area to consider.
Yeah, great. And I mean, even thinking about standardized packaging for when you think globally, other kinds of tobacco products like smokeless tobacco, BDs in certain parts of the world. So there are a lot of really important issues there. Let me try and get one more question in, and more kudos for your great presentation. And this person is asking, because you've done work in the African region, what do you see as the most important research questions regarding tobacco control policies that you think are important for researchers in Africa to focus on?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and thank you for all the questions so far. I think the biggest thing, again, coming from my perspective, thinking like the industry, because the industry is light years ahead, and we know that from the documents. If you just take this perspective and look at history, and so I always go back in the past because we have to understand what happened. And so when prevalence levels declined in high-income countries like the United States, Europe, even in places like Japan, New Zealand, Australia. Throughout the 90s, 2000s, when globalization, trade liberalization hit, the companies got smart and they started to go into places where they had, regulatory contexts that were inefficient or corrupt or things of that nature, and really started to market and open their products in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and even Eastern Europe. But Africa really wasn't a big market until recently. And so if you look at Africa and China as like the two big markets now, the companies are heavily investing into all of these countries in Africa. So that's one point. So they're putting a lot more of their money and resources into not just their investments, but also their marketing and their lobbying, efforts as well. And so if you look at Africa, they have some of the lowest prevalence levels in the world. So in some countries, like I'm doing research in Ethiopia, and they have like 1-2% for women, 8% for men. So it's like an average. It's not really high. But the industry sees that as like a new market. So they're heavily marketing towards young people. So like things like shisha, tobacco, like that's big in a lot of these countries. So regulating that, but also using flavors and colors, but really targeting women, especially young women, and doing things like promotions. You get like items involved. And so I think if you understand it from that standpoint, and Africa is projected to be one of the biggest increases in the world by 2030, 2040, 2050, And so we have to think prevention. Like, so don't allow the prevalence level to creep up that high. And so, I mean, there's a number of things you can do, but the big issue in Africa is implementation. I mean, there, if you look across the board, and Joanne, I see you nodding too, you've done a lot of work this area, but there's some great policies on the books. But then it's a question of implementation. And so I think much, much more efforts need to be done on policy implementation and regulations, things of that nature. We're out of time, but I can go on, but I think that's the big focus. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. And there are lots of great research approaches that you can use to study implementation through observations, key informant interviews, all kinds of approaches. So yeah, terrific. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but Eric, thank you so much for just a wonderful presentation of a really important topic in tobacco control. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining. See you next time.